We are now live on YouTube with the October 29th, 2018 meeting of the Node.js and JSF Joint Foundation Bootstrap team meeting. We are joined right now by 18 different attendees representing organizations such as the Node.js membership, the Node.js Foundation board, the JSF projects, and the JSF TAC, as well as the JSF board. We have a full agenda today, so we're not going to go through introductions as we did last time, and we're going to get right into it. So the first thing that we have is an update from legal. This is a 5-minute time box to be led by Mike Dolan. It includes questions for the legal committee around trademark, as well as an issue that's open to seek and resolve bylaw differences. Mike, would you like to take this?
Yeah, I can take this. I think also Andy Updegrove and Steve from the JSF, both their legal counsel are on the line as well. It appears they're both muted at the moment, but if they do want to, please come off of mute. The quick update here is just really, I had a conversation with them to try to kick off setting up the bylaws in such a way where we get everything ready to go and then insert the various pieces of the community governance model portion into it. Most of this is not, bylaws, most of it is not going to detail out what I think most people are interested in. It'll just say things like, we'll need to insert things like, who's on the board and what committees are there, and, any committee that, has a bylaws purpose. I don't, even a lot of committees and a lot of other work does not get captured in the bylaws. So it's a pretty high level document. And I think in the Node.js bylaws, Andy had done some work on integrating the ComCom in particular because of its role in the board. But beyond that, there's a number of things that the communities may be doing that don't necessarily need to be in the bylaws themselves. So I asked them to help get a jump start on that. With respect to trademarks, there's the trademark license agreement around the Node.js trademark with Joint. Our goal would be to not disrupt and just keep that as is, going into any sort of merging of the two project groups together. So at this point, I don't anticipate a need to do anything there, but we already have that in place, and we'll be working out, whether, anything, gets triggered that would require us to go and get approval of any sort of change or whatnot. But so far, I don't have any need on that one in terms of something changing. Does that make sense, Miles? Or I'm not sure where all these questions came from or how they got on the agenda, but I forget who the originators were.
I believe that if we dug into it really quickly, the first one, which was the trademark question, that was opened by James Snell, who I do not see on the meeting right now. The second question came, the bylaw difference, I believe that was Sam Ruby's thread. Does anyone have any questions about these two issues before we move on to the next agenda items? Feel free to use the hand raising within the app or talk.
I was just going to add that I'm not sure the questions in that issue was answered. They were pretty specific.
In which issue, Michael?
So like 25.
Let me go in there. I was just looking at the agenda.
Yeah, James's specific question was, if the Node.js project decide to leave, could they somehow, how would the trademark relationship we have with Joint fit into that?
I mean, I'm not sure what that would entail. In that hypothetical, who's leaving and
I think it's coming from the JS Foundation's governance, where the projects are free to leave if they want to.
The Node.js license agreement is with the Node.js Foundation entity. What we've been discussing thus far is keeping the Node.js Foundation entity in place and just revising the bylaws to allow the incorporation of additional new projects. And so in that structure, ideally, nothing changes that would disrupt the existing trademark license agreement with Joyent that is already in place.
They're
So
if we incorporate the ability for projects to leave the foundation, the foundation structure, which is the Node.js foundation structure at the moment, who would or how could that license agreement be made more portable, or what would need to happen if, say, the Node project would want to, at some point in the future, leave the new joint foundation?
that would be up to the Node project in that situation, negotiating and getting a license with Joyent.
Or negotiating to have the license transferable to some other legal entity.
The current agreement that's in place is non-transferable.
Okay, then it would have to be a newly negotiated license agreement. Okay.
Yeah,
I think that's the answer.
It's just something we don't control. From the foundation perspective, it's not in our control to go and allow transfers beyond what was agreed to in the original license agreement.
I don't think anyone in the project has or has not recently seen the license agreement. So the fact that the license agreement is non-transferable from the Node.js Foundation is enough information for us to answer that question specifically.
Yeah, I forget the specific terms, but I think it's non-transferable without Joyent's approval. So you're essentially negotiating with Joyent either way.
Right, which is also now Samsung.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we've got the update, and we're over time on this line item. So we're gonna move on to the next bit. For those who still have questions, Mike, would you be available to talk to people one-on-one?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Excellent, and then we can also take it back to the thread. The next item that we have on the agenda is a meaty topic we've got 20 minutes for, and it's governance of the Bootstrap process. So there's a whole bunch of different issues that we've got in here, from a draft staging process to figuring out how often and when do we meet. We've got some initial governance documented, some guiding principles, vision and mission. So I was thinking we can just go through each of these items and try to figure them out. The first one that we have on here is number 23, which is the staging process. This is something that was drafted by Jory, who's unfortunately not able to join us today. The drafting process was breaking down an order of how proposals could be proposed and then eventually adopted. It was presented as a 3-stage process with an initial proposal, a draft proposal, accepted proposal, and complete. As Jory isn't here to lead the discussion, and it looks like based on the pull request, there's still things that need to be discussed. I think that this could be more of just for your information for the people who are involved on this call right now. Does anyone have specific questions about this staging process that we're discussing? Okay, with that, I think we can move on to the next light item, which is how often and when do we meet? So currently the time that we have is this time, 2 p.m. EDT, which is 11 a.m. PDT, and we have a matrix of times on the invite. It was discussed that in the last meeting that this time is an ongoing time and a rolling time is not necessarily fair to those from various time zones who may want to participate in this meeting. I had initially just proposed 9 a.m. EDT as being an alternative time, but that did receive some pushback, and some people, including Jim Snell, has asked for perhaps that we do a survey to find a more specific time. I will drop a link to that survey that James has asked people to fill out. It's here inside of the notes now, and it's in the original issue, which is issue number 21. So with that context in place, do people have a problem with the times of 2 and 9 a.m.? Would they prefer going through this draft, the collecting data process? Are there alternative times that people would think are better? Or should we not do alternating times at all? Does anyone have any thoughts or opinions?
Alternating is fine for me. Seems like it'll catch more people in more time zones.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Alternating is fine. We have to reach more people and adapt to the time zones. Yes.
I guess the question was, do we just go for alternating, or do we try and fill out the sheet to find better times, like better alternating times even? Right? I think that's what you're asking, Miles.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the big ones. Like, do we want to just start with like 2 p.m. EDT and 9 a.m. EDT? Or would we rather move forward with doing this survey to find the second time?
I guess in the middle ground would be pick those two to start, do the survey in parallel, and then adjust if necessary.
So I know that in the thread, James, and I can't recall, Sam, if you had an issue with it, but does anyone object to those 2 times as the times that we start with? I'm hearing no objections, so let's move forward. Because of the way that we had alternating meetings working in the schedule and what we already have in people's calendars, I'd like to suggest that we keep the 2 p.m. time again next week, and then for the following week, we would move to the 9 a.m. EDT time. So that would mean that on Monday, the 5th of December, we would meet at 2 p.m.
November.
Oh, did I say December? I meant November. We'd meet at 2 p.m. EDT, and on the 12th. Yeah.
So you keep calling it EDT. Daylight savings time ends in a week. So are you talking about 2 p.m. Eastern time no matter what?
Yeah, so I should just say Eastern time.
Yeah, so that means that it's going to shift by an hour for people who aren't on daylight savings and all that sort of stuff. But cool. Okay, just as long as we're clear on that. Thanks.
But also, to be clear, some of the world shifted this past weekend. So
right, and if you're in the southern hemisphere, you're going to shift in the opposite direction. So it's going to get really weird.
Well, maybe it makes sense for us to punt the discussion of this until all the time zones have settled.
I think for now we can just settle on a time and just say it's going to be this time Eastern time, and you know, we can have the discussion again in a few weeks if it ends up being a problem.
Okay, let's move forward with that. 2 p.m. and 9 a.m. Eastern time. I'll update the issue and our calendars so that everyone knows exactly when it is, and then in a couple of weeks, as we have some meetings, we can figure out, you know, what makes sense and what's a problem. Thank you very much. So on to the next item in the list here that we have is doc initial governance. This is number 19. It's a pull request that I'd opened. It's has a basic list of, you know, like who's available for team membership, when we have meetings, breakdown of the consensus seeking process, merging new PRs into the repository, and the developer certificate of origin. One of the things that was brought up in here was a question about what we should do if we don't have consensus and there's multiple decisions for something. And the other was the stage proposal process and whether or not we wanted to like have that documented and figured out first. Has anyone who's had a look at this or is hearing my overview, I guess like one question would be, do you think that we should land what we have now and iterate, or do you think that we should reach consensus of all of the bits in the PR first?
James's suggestions make sense, but I don't see a reason to block on them if you're willing to iterate.
Yeah, I think it's along those lines. If we could get it into be like a staging draft or something where it's clear it's not a final document, then landing and PRing and changes. It's a good way to go.
Okay, so with that being said, does anyone object to me adding a disclaimer at the top that these are draft governance and it's subject to change in the coming weeks?
Maybe just add stage 0 into the name of the file.
It's a great idea. Okay, so I'll go on that iteration, and since we've had no objections, if there's no objections in the PR, we can go ahead and land that this week. So the next one we have up is number 9, which was guiding principles. This was James's pull request, and I believe that in the meeting he had initially said that if he couldn't attend, he'd want number 9 and number 25 punted for now. Does anyone object to moving forward from this pull request for right now? Is there anything that people wanted to discuss? Okay, so we'll move on from number 9 for right now. The next one we have is number 1, add vision and mission. And I believe that one actually got closed and pulled in to Adam's larger pull request. Is that correct, Adam?
Yep, that's correct. It's number 7. We'll address it at the end here.
Okay, great. Number 2, how do we govern this group? Has also been closed now in lieu of number 19. Number 4, which was add initial mission statements and drafts from governance discussion. Tierney, do you have anything to add about this? What's going on with it? What its current status is?
Nope, nothing specific. Just I created it at the Collaborator Summit, and that's mostly, or if I believe I'm talking about the same one. And it was just meant to kind of log everything that was done there, if I'm talking about the same one.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I also pulled in language from that into number 7 as well.
Tierney, do you object to us closing number 4 in lieu of number 7 then?
No, although I haven't reviewed 7, but if Adam, I trust Adam on that. So if he thinks it's a full 100% replacement, go ahead. The only thing I do want to make sure is captured is there was some of the content that was like specific. Oh, no, that's it. Never mind. Ignore that. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I've closed it. Thank you both very much. So as we were talking about, let's go to number 7 right now. We've got 10 minutes left on the agenda for this line item. So let's try to see if we can do number 7 in about 5 minutes and leave about 5 minutes for the last item there that we have on a budget process. Does that work for you, Adam?
Cool, that works perfectly, yeah.
Okay, Adam, can you introduce number 7 for us?
Yeah, so number 7 was my take on first pass at process. And it started touching a little bit on how we submit proposals. In our last meeting, we started talking about the staging process, but I think the staging process PR number 23 refers to some ideas that were started in this PR as well. So I think we will probably need to go through some reconciliation here between 23, number 7, and Miles, your PR number 19. So number 7, taking a high level view here, there's a document set up for a README, which defines process a little bit as I had seen it 2 weeks ago now. So it probably needs to be updated and or thrown out in favor of Miles's version. There are also 3 files here for the top level committees where we can collect ideas. That's where I migrated language from number 4 and number 1 into there as mission and vision statement drafts. We had both were just a collection of ideas, and I unified the 2 into a single document here. But the foundation.md file was a collection of in-flight thoughts about recommendations for the foundation and bylaws and vision and mission statements, which probably again needs another couple eyes on it in lieu of the new bylaws work. There are 2 files shimmed out for collecting ideas for CPC and the Community Council. And I think the meatiest and most important part of this was, as is referenced in PR number 23 in the draft staging process, it references a directory called proposals. In this PR, there's a directory called projects, which is an RFC process for proposing new process. So I think that can probably evolve into, I'd like to see that evolve into how stage 0 proposals are actually PR'd into the repo. I think some structure around the format of that would help the process along and make it more inviting to newcomers who might take a look at the process and see a folder with a whole bunch of ad hoc proposal.md files with no structure and be a little confused about how to best contribute. Yeah, that's the structure of number 7.
So a quick question for you, Adam. Do you think it would be possible to break out the bits that are duplicates with the two other PRs and maybe move those over to the other PRs so that we can have, more of a, like smaller iterative changes?
Yep, I'd be happy to do that. I can PR the RFC stuff into the proposals branch or stage proposals branch and bring in specific content into your, I think your PR would be best to merge it in with number 19, right?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
I can split that apart.
So with that being said, Sam Ruby has chimed in and stated that he thinks the decentralized budget authority makes more sense for the next agenda item. So we've moved it over. We have 6 minutes and 35 seconds left for this section on the government of Bootstrap process. We've kind of gone through each of the line items. Is there anything from like a general discussion standpoint that anyone would like to bring up or discuss or questions based on everything that we've gone through? Okay, excellent. I will take the silence as saying that we should move forward. The next thing that we have on the agenda here is creating expectations of the foundation draft. This was to be led by Tracy, who hasn't been able to join us yet. They will be here soon. In the meantime, I do want to point everyone towards a slide deck that we have. I'm pasting it inside of the chat once more. This was initially put together by Mike Dolan. Mike, would you like to do a brief breakdown of this deck and how you're thinking we can utilize it?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, Miles. So the slide deck here, and it's organized in such a way to try to provide inputs to the lawyers who'll be involved in setting up and drafting the governance documents that go into whatever we end up as the output. And so we have Stephen, who represents the JS Foundation on. We also have Andy Updegrove on, who's been representing the Node.js Foundation. And so the goal here is really to try to isolate what are the key things that they need input on in terms of the governance structural elements that would be created. So really we're looking for what are sort of the decision-making structures within this merged organization, who has the ability to participate in those structures, what is their role in those structures, who makes decisions, and what are the outputs of those structures. So really we're just looking at what are the key building blocks of this organization. There are many additional details that you all may be interested in figuring out and detailing out around how meetings are conducted or when meetings are held, or various process elements in terms of how business is resolved. Many of those things are likely not things that need to go into the governance documents themselves. And often what we do is we try to just focus on keeping those things that the community wants to do in terms of its own cultural style and ability to govern itself in a separate document that you would manage. So if you have, for example, the cross-platform or cross-project council, a CPC guidelines document or a CPC charter that you would control as the CPC in terms of updating and revising it instead of, say, putting it into the bylaws. And so I'll let Steve and Andy comment if there's anything else they want to say on this, but my intention here was to try to set up a framework or a structure that we could start to focus on what the different elements of the governance structure look like, what the responsibilities, what the outputs, who's participating, and any roles in those. And by roles, I mean, sometimes we have a chair or vice chair, or, different types of roles within each of these committees that might roll up into something else. So for example, if you have the cross-project council, may have someone who is a chair to guide the cross-project council meetings. And then that person may be the same person who, for example, might represent the cross-project council on the board. It could also be that the cross-project council identifies somebody else who would be the representative to the board, similar to the way the ComCom does that currently. So, you know, it's up in the air how we structure this, but what we're trying to do is just get at what are the key elements, what are the key roles, and make sure we understand, you know, how all this fits together as one piece so that we can draft the bylaws that would be a part of this. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. Adam, you have your hand up.
Just a quick clarifying question. So you said that the charters for CPC and C3 would be under the purview of those committees right now in the Node.js organization, at least, in order to make changes to a charter. Both the TSC and ComCom have to get approval from the board to change those documents. Would that be the same in this new foundation?
It depends. If the CPC is more or less the top level technical community, you could have it, you know, with approval from the CPC. You could have it that a subcommittee of the CPC would, you know, be able to approve a charter. I don't think I have clarity yet in terms of what people see in terms of the relationship between these different elements to give you an answer, Adam, other than if it is a committee chartered by the board itself, and usually those are only the committees that would have board representation or somehow a direct connection to the board and the bylaws, then usually we would put those into a charter that committee would own responsibility for. There may be some sort of additional permission, like getting the CPC to approve it or something that we could build in, but it really varies. In terms of, you know, the daily governance of how you operate, there's usually like an operations document or, you know, some sort of document that would be created that talks about when we meet, where we meet, what we do for minutes, where we post them, things like that, that just don't go into sort of a charter or bylaws that, you know, generally each of these groups owns on their own with no approval authority or oversight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that does. And I think those governance docs are what the stage proposal process and RFC process are set up for, decided to tackle. It's good to hear that there's flexibility on the charter document approval process, though. Good to know.
Yeah, Andy and Steve, feel free to chime in. I think you're both on mute if I got anything different from the way you would say it. So.
No, I think you got it all.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Sarah, you have your hand up.
So the best way that I can think of describing this to people in the community is minimum viable bylaws. We want to make the friction between the project governance and a board, any board oversight, as small as possible. I mean, we've seen changes to charters which take too long by everyone's measures to get approved. And we're trying to figure out, this is an opportunity for us to make sure that we get the things that are necessary into the bylaws, but move as much as possible down into the projects, the different project governance components, including the cross-project council or the ComCom, if that ends up being a top level organization. But the idea being that to try to take away as many friction points as possible. So to Adam's point, a lot of what the process is developing is some of the charters for the subcommittees as well.
Okay, with that being said, is there anything else that people want to chime in regarding this deck, or are we good on the deck for right now?
Well, the deck talks about the board being responsible for the budget, which I think is a good jumping off point for discussion of issue 28.
Sure. Sam, do you want to introduce issue 28 and give a bit of an introduction as to like what it's covering and what it's attempting to capture?
Yeah, issue 28, I opened it up 3 days ago, so it's over the weekend. Most people may not have a chance to read it. The ASF is organized quite differently than described on page 18 of the slide deck. The ASF has a president who's a volunteer non-board position that's responsible for operations, including brand management, fundraising, marketing, publicity, et cetera. And each of those areas has a budget that they're responsible for. So they build a budget, the budget's all rolled up at the president, and that's all presented to the board annually for approval. And once approved, then each of these areas own their own budgets. And the board gets monthly reports, and there's a separate accounting and the like, and a treasurer oversees all that stuff. But it decentralizes the role of budgets. I think we can, I took budget as a first thing, but we can dive down later into trademarks and all sorts of other areas. Instead of centralizing this to the board and everybody feeling like they got to have a person on the board so that they can have their say, this organization, I think, merits consideration by this group.
So one question I didn't, I'm sorry, did I speak over someone?
No,
one question I had about the president role is, how do you select and find that person? I mean, you fill that role in Apache, I presume that it's a large portion of your day-to-day responsibilities at IBM.
The board selects this person. Yes, IBM gives me a fair amount of time to work on this. I'm the president of the ASF, if I wasn't clear.
So I can bring up that in the past, it had been discussed about making some sort of subcommittee of the board have responsibility for their own budget. How exactly that would be set up and how it would work, has never really been totally worked out. But I think that the idea there was so that, programs and things could run without requiring it to go all the way up to the board for approval. And at least my impression from board members is that people wanted to see this happen. It was just a matter of creating that structure and making it work. To other Node.js board members who are on the call, does anyone have more context than I do on that?
I think you summarized it pretty well, Miles. Historically, what Sam has described is similar to the way the board operates today. Proposals are made about budget allocations, generally by the, either in the past it's been Michael Rogers when he was the community director, because we didn't have an ED when the foundation was formed. Later on, Mark, when he became the ED, I wasn't on the board at that time, but I assume the process hasn't changed much. Allocations get spent from, budgets roll over. So delegating that responsibility makes sense. I think the largest question that I have is, how do you have a template for someone who's not necessarily finance minded to build a budget? Because funding a program and executing on it, if your day-to-day responsibilities are coding, can be a challenge. And so that's education is what I would be most looking for in this type of process.
I think an obvious question would be to Sam. Sam, how is that handled over at the ASF?
I mean, I've got links in there for how we actually do individual things. I'm not certain what education is required, but I will say that the areas that actually need to have additional person who takes care of things on a day-to-day basis, they actually hire people. It's part of their budget. And that person works in the same committee as the people who are volunteers, taking direction from the volunteers, but then actually executing on a day-to-day basis.
So it seems to me then, and someone please correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of the high level ask would be that we have a structure that would allow for this. I guess it would either be the C3 or the cross-project counselor, potentially both, having oversight to allocate budget to things without having to escalate it directly to the board.
Okay, I may not have been clear. The way this works is on an annual basis, we present a budget, a rolled up budget that is developed over a period of months. The first is a 5-year plan, then there's a 1-year plan. There is a budget that's presented to the board annually. The board approves that budget, so the board gets ultimate authority. But then once that budget's in place, We don't go on with ad hoc requests typically throughout the year. We operate within that budget.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fundamental difference is that the project owns the budget as opposed to, say, the executive director or somebody in the foundation. The board still approves it, but fundamentally the way it gets put together is the project, not.
You're still going to hit interesting contractual points. For example, hiring. You know, who hires the contract? How does that person get health benefits? Where are those health benefits coming from? Today, that would be the Linux Foundation. So there are still places where there are touch points with either someone at the LF or I don't want to say the quote unquote board, but they're administrative things that, you know, it's not just about writing people checks.
Yeah, no, I agree. At the Apache Software Foundation, we've got, instead of the Linux Foundation, we've got a company named Virtual Incorporated that actually is who the people report to, and they take care of all the filing of tax returns and all the other stuff.
And I don't think the proposal is to change any of that. So there would still be the Linux Foundation. There still would be staff, but I guess it's that the volunteers lead and champion putting together the budgets, as opposed to like our model has been, well, our model has been, I'm not sure we've seen the budgets. You could see one where like the foundation puts together the budgets and the project's consulted. This seems to be different in that it's the project puts together the budgets and the foundation is consulted. And then finally the board signs off.
So if I might get a perspective from a different project we host called Linux Foundation Networking, where we have about 10 different networking projects. And the way that they do it is that each project community builds up what they need for the year into their budget per project in terms of what resources they're expecting or needing. That generally gets rationalized at the CPC level of what's been under discussion for Node. So they call it a TAC. But in this context, it would be what you've been looking at called the CPC, where they look at where there's common requests for similar things from different projects. Can they just have one request for budget to basically cover all of it? And so they align a number of things. Then they identify what are the actual individual project needs that are unique. And then that budget goes up into the board conversation. It's going on right now in the fall timeframe for approval, assuming that the membership numbers and renewals come in at the beginning of the year at the same rate. The governing board of Linux Foundation Networking then gives it an approval and they move on. If there's inordinate amount of request in terms of more budget requested than is available, then the board has to figure out like where the priorities are in terms of providing feedback back to the TAC to say, there's not enough budget for all of this. Can you try to help us get this back to, some other number and maybe prioritize, these things. And so those are the conversations that'll happen in that context. But most of our projects do a bottoms up from the projects as a starting point. And maybe that hasn't been done in Node in the past, but I would give you guidance that is usually a helpful way to approach this thing. Does that make sense?
Indeed. Thank you. Is there any other specific thoughts or discussion around budget right now, or should we move to some of the other issues that we have on the docket for right now?
I only have one for you, Sam. Have there been types of budget where this model has not worked well? I guess that's a no.
I guess who are you asking?
I said, I'm sorry, I must have cut out there. I asked Sam.
Oh, ask me? No, basically, I'm pretty happy with this.
Okay.
So I'm proposing it.
Do you run events? That's the only thing that's conspicuously like missing from this list is a event, or does it get run under marketing?
We got conferences. We just had Apache.
Oh, sorry, I totally overlooked that. I apologize. Thank you.
Just a different word. I mean, a lot of issues here are trying to get everybody using the same language. We do have conferences. So ApacheCon just completed about a month ago. It was in Montreal. It was pretty successful. And if we were to consider such a thing, I could get individuals at the Apache Software Foundation responsible for an individual area who, I mean, I think they'd love to chat and share their experiences. And I mean, they're pretty happy with it.
A quick question that I have to our legal counsel and those from the LF. When we're drafting initial bylaws for the foundation, is something like overseeing a budget something that is in the purview of those bylaws, or is this something that we draft or make motions for outside of bylaws?
Ultimately, Andy or Steve can chime in, but ultimately the board of directors of any organization is responsible for the dollars. I don't think you can pass, you know, fiscal responsibility on anyone else.
Right. But Sam's proposal, you know, the board does get that responsibility. They approve it every year, and so
yeah, how you allocate decision making around budget is, you know,
right, and that's what a lot of this boils down to is where the decisions get made and who has the day-to-day responsibility for executing the spending.
Yeah, I can't think of a single bylaws where the budget is actually covered in the bylaws itself. So I don't think that's.
Well, the president role at Apache is different than the president role at the JSF, and there is no president role at the Node Foundation. So I think there would be some language change in the role of the president.
Well, many organizations have a president role. You know, what those roles are is part of what we need to define in terms of what it is. You know, the Apache model is a little bit different than most of what we do here, because you also have a different structure in terms of, I don't know what the ASF's, you know, per project allocation is, but I think the intention here is for projects here to get individual funding. And I don't know that, you know, the ASF budget really gets down into all of the projects.
I would question that assumption. I would actually think a better way is for all the conference people to work together and all the trademark people to work together and all the, I mean, individual areas. We have tried a few different ways over the past 20 years in the Apache Software Foundation, and we've come up with a model that I think is worth considering.
And Sam, just to clarify, it sounds like you're not advocating for pushing fiduciary responsibility down to the volunteers in the project level. You're pushing budget preparation responsibility that the board then approves.
No, I would say that no. Pushing down the actual approvals of individual expenses is done. We've got D&O insurance that covers the officers that are making those decisions, but. And it does, again, the board gets not only initial approval, they get monthly updates. I can show you we post all the reports online, so I can actually point to all the reporting that's done.
That would be helpful. That was going to be my last question, was about KPI reporting for those allocations, because at the end of the day, you know, whoever is making the hypotheses about what's going to be successful should be doing so with performance indicators as to whether or not those hypotheses are correct.
Yes, I mean, we do every single month. The board gets both year-to-date and monthly expenditures, budgets versus actuals, et cetera. And every month those things are approved and posted on the website.
Great, that answers that question. I think the last point that I would make is that you had mentioned that the debate about an executive director versus a president has been quite contentious at times. And that surprised me, that I would feel that the roles could be interchangeable. And I thought maybe you could shed some more light on what the nature of the controversy was.
Well, the major controversy is whether having a president who's a volunteer sustainable. And over time, what's actually winning out is having the higher level roles be volunteers and being supported by people who do the day-to-day execution that are paid staff. The paid staff are, I mean, in essence, they take direction from the person who's a volunteer, but they actually physically report into, in our case, virtual, in your case, it would be Linux Foundation. And that model is increasingly working. I'm not certain I've answered the question.
Somewhat. Do you see a reason why an executive director wouldn't work with this model?
What would an executive director do?
Say that it's a change in title only and that it's not volunteer.
If it's, I mean, that could work. That could work as long as it's a person that is, in essence, respected by the community, et cetera. I mean,
I agree with that. I mean, you know, an executive director should be respected by the community and have roots to it. I don't think it's a job that anyone can just walk into.
But so far in 20 years, we've never actually had an executive director. We've managed to make it work with volunteers, and we're now finding more and more ways in which it's actually advantageous. We find it advantageous not to have volunteers.
I have a clarifying question. When you say volunteer, are you talking about people who may or may not be working on their own time? Because like in Node, at least, we have quite a few people who are working full-time for companies who are invested in Node. They may not be working on this particular thing, but they have some leeway. Or are you saying they're working purely on their own time outside of work hours?
No. As an example, in my case, I work for IBM. IBM is paying my salary, and that gives me a fair amount of latitude to work on this type of stuff. But so I am working for a company that's interested in the Apache Software Foundation.
And is that the norm or the exception when it comes to the volunteers in these groups?
I'd say it's pretty much the norm.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, because I know something that we've struggled quite a bit with is bandwidth. There's a lot of people who are stretched very thin, who are already in our project, at least, who are doing quite a bit of work. And it sounds like in a similar position that you are. But I know that like when I was an employee of the foundation, I was able to get things like certainly a lot more done when that was, you know, my paid priority time versus a part of my time. So that was, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's the only risk that I really see is the inability to fill the volunteer positions. It'd be great if they were there. I have no doubt about it. How do you compensate for when there are no such volunteers? It would be the only risk I see.
Which we actually had the problem when it came to doing a completely volunteer contribution base, like for instance, for the Node certification. So we were trying to do that, and we ended up running very short on bandwidth because of the amount of time and effort that it took and expertise to keep that moving forward. And I'd be interested to see budget-wise, like the budgets. I think that's a really awesome idea, but the time it takes is certainly quite a bit of a commitment in itself. I'd love to see people volunteer and step up to that.
One thing that I had suggested, and I don't know if it's appropriate, and I think we're maybe getting a little in the weeds with the suggestion, but that if the foundation has a program manager, that this is something the program manager could support on. Not necessarily lead, but be someone that could support with execution and paperwork and whatever needs to be done to support whatever volunteers are doing things.
We already had that. So are you saying that we would need more bandwidth for it? Because we had that in the current and still we're very under-resourced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we would need to have more bandwidth for it.
I think the other thing that Sam didn't mention, but may have mentioned somewhere else, was that you potentially end up with some prioritization based on what volunteers you can get. So for example, if you can't get volunteers for certification, then that might stretch out just like any of the regular work within the project. And so you may not get everything, you know, you can't necessarily say this is what's going to get done and then have volunteers do what somebody else has decided. You'll get what people decide is the things they think are important to volunteer for. But that may match what the project feels is important. And, you know, you'll have ownership of the project for those things because they're volunteering, and that's why it's moving forward. And then supported, of course, by staff who can, you know, deal with the things that are urgent that you can't just wait to happen.
Yeah, one would argue though that that's part of the challenge of open source is that if you only have people contributing to things that they're interested or want to contribute, then you have gaping holes in areas such as documentation or community that may be undervalued but desperately needed.
I'd agree that is one of the potential downsides.
So with that being said, we have 3 minutes left. We did not get to 2 items. One was about whether or not we want board representation, which I think we touched into. And then like the kind of top level item that we were talking about was creating the expectations for foundation draft. Tracy, with the last couple of minutes that we have, do you want to give an update on kind of where this draft is at and what kind of work you would like to be seeing done or how people can help move this forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the big thing for me really was just more input because, you know, we've got the individual groups working. Let me pull this up, I'm sorry. I mean, this was just, you know, this was what we were hoping to at least get, you know, in one way or another back to the board. So that they're both boards, so that they would have an understanding of what the projects want. The big concern I had really was like when the next meetings were for us to be able to communicate this and set an arbitrary deadline. But I've been having trouble getting those dates.
So an update, Tracy, you may have missed from the last meeting was that we could push the dates and perhaps we didn't even need to give the same level of deliverables since we are all meeting in this one meeting now. But I do think capturing this information is still incredibly important. But yeah, maybe that's something that we could take offline and bring back to the issue and bring up at the top of the next meeting so that we have, you know, the proper time to dig into it.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so we're at the top of the hour now. Does anyone have anything else to add before we call it a day on the meeting? Okay, see you all next week at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you.